And it just gives you that sense also of control, to some extent, control back. And you're not, it takes that feeling of victimhood and feeling overwhelmed by how unfair the world is. And it just gives you something else to focus on, which is, well, what can I do about it? Right. None of us are totally, lacking in any agency or any ability to affect anything. So what can I do whenever in any context? I won't be able to control everything, but what can I do given these realities? And so instead of, again, screaming into the wind, right? And like, oh, this is so unfair. Yes, you're right. Probably many unfair things will happen, but what can you do about it and move forward? That for me is like, well, what can I do? It always comes back to, what can I control? There are many things I cannot control, but what can I control?
I create clear thinking and decisive leaders who can amplify their influence. Contact me to find out how I can help you or your organisation.
And today, our guest is Rupal Patel. How are you doing?
I'm really well, Judith. Thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I'm really super keen to have this conversation. But before we do that, is there a certain genre in books that you like?
Ooh. No. I've gotten into a sort of a stretch of nonfiction, to be honest. But I read pretty much everything. I love good fiction. I got for a while into what they refer to as cozy mysteries, sort of lighthearted. Yeah,
I did. I went through a phase of cozy mysteries. I can't make them now.
Yeah, they're really good fun, right? And some of the writing can be really, really good. So no, I'm sort of a magpie when it comes to my reading, as long as it does one of three things: either entertains, inspires, or informs, right? So I'm quite broad in the things that I read.
Cool. All right, tell us a little bit more about you.
Gosh, where to begin? So I guess actually akin to the initial question you asked me, I'm a reader. I have always been a voracious consumer of words. So not just the written word, but also just communication and songs and other art forms that rely on words and communication. And I think that has really, in many ways, sort of been a theme that has sustained itself throughout my entire life. I mean, as I said, from a very, very young age, I was writing, sort of fiction and plays and cartoon episodes for some of my favorite cartoons as a child. And then, that evolved and grew. But basically, writing and words have been a huge part of my life ever since I was a child. And I think for me, the power of words and the power of communication is something that has never failed to inspire me or awe me or just reassure me about the human race. Yeah.
Excellent. Cool. Thank you for that. It's a good share.
Yeah.
So where do we begin? So I take it, if we're going to talk about the CIA mindset, can I ask, was you in the CIA?
I was, yes. So I was there from my early 20s to my early 30s. And so, I spent, I would say, the most formative initial part of my career at the CIA as an analyst. And for the bulk of my time there, I was doing political and military analysis on one of our war efforts overseas. And it was an incredible trial by fire, throwing myself into the deep end in that way. And it was, again, in many ways, sort of formed much of the mindset, but also a lot of just those life lessons that are captured in my book, but also in just how I live my day-to-day life.
What did you enjoy about working for the CIA?
I would say two things. One, it was being around brilliant people. So I am the type of person who I imagine, perhaps like many people, am very, very sensitive to my surroundings. And I was lucky to be on an incredibly high-performing team full of brilliant people who were also really fun and really smart and really interesting. And it really forced me to sort of, again, up my game in ways that I didn't even think were possible. So that was incredible, just from, sort of being surrounded by so much brilliance and using that to help me sort of refine, my abilities. And then just the bigger mission, or not just, but the other thing that I loved about it was the bigger sense of mission, right? Our mission as an agency is to protect the U.S. and its citizens from all threats. And as an American, as someone who still believes very much in the power of what America can be and in our role in the world, and some of those values that, of course, are not uniquely American, but the way we've sort of brought democracy in many ways, as an inspiration, and sort of creating the momentum for things like the French Revolution and many of the other European revolutions that sort of saw the end of monarchy and the beginning of modern democracy. For me, it was really important to be a part of something bigger. And I, because my country and its values mean so much to me, it was particularly meaningful to be a part of an organization that, works, I won't say without contradiction or without a darker side. I'm not naive to that. But, the fundamental operating principle was to protect America and its interests. And that, for me, meant a lot.
Yeah, I understand that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Is there a particular reason why you left?
Yeah. And it's sadly a slightly mundane reason. There were two things. The most mundane part of it is age, in the sense that, as I shared earlier, I was there from my early 20s to my early 30s. And when I was in my 20s, it felt like 30 was such a big milestone, that sort of after 30, you sort of fall off a professional cliff, right? And that sense of like, oh, after 30, you're old, your sort of your sell by date or your shelf life has expired. And it just was this weird conception of like what life after 30 would look like. And I had this idea that, if I didn't leave the agency before or early into my 30s, then I would be unmarketable to the outside world because of all of those, silly preconceived ideas that I had about what it meant to be, an older person. And so I would say it was sort of as I was approaching that milestone birthday, I just started looking around and just seeing, well, what else is out there? What else would I potentially be interested in? And there was, like I said, no big sort of push or no big pull. But the one thing that I didn't really know was that I wanted to live in London. I had, worked here a lot. I had traveled here a lot, and it just felt like a really a great place to be. And so when I was looking for opportunities or options, outside of the agency, I thought, well, okay, this is one point that can anchor me, this desire to be in London for at least a few years. So I just started looking for options out here. And what seemed to make the most sense was to go to business school, because I thought, okay, well, if I'm leaving the public sector and transitioning into a life in the private sector, it would be useful to have that foundational sort of grounding in business terminology and the basics of business. So that's the how and the why. But it was really sort of that idea of like, well, leave before you, again, like I said, you're past your sell by date. But also this additional idea, and this is less mundane, is sort of testing myself in a new way. Because, what I loved about the agency is that it did test me in many, many ways, mentally, physically, intellectually, all of these things. And I didn't want to get comfortable, and I wanted to see what else I was made of, and to see, well, okay, well, I've proven that I can succeed in this context, in this environment, do important work with great people, all of that stuff. What else am I made of? And that desire to sort of test myself was the other big reason that I thought, well, let me just go out into the world and see what else there is.
Yeah, that's really good. So your book's called From CIA to CEO.
Yeah.
What my first question, it was a bit mundane question, but we recently had an ex-FBI guy on.
Okay. Yeah.
Great conversation. And he said he had to get his book passed by the FBI. I'm just curious, did you have to get your book passed by the CIA as well?
For sure. Yeah, for sure. So yes, and it's a really easy process. So, you have a lifelong, of course, legal, but also ethical requirements to make sure that you are not divulging anything unwittingly, that you shouldn't be divulging to the public. And so anything that we put out into the world that is for sort of mass consumption has to be, sort of that references, of course, our time at the agency. We have to get cleared, but it's a really straightforward process. It's, we worked very well together. They asked me when I needed my manuscripts back by. They were, really good about working to my deadline. So it was a really straightforward process.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so let's get into it then.
Yes.
CIA mindset. So I know you've got like a subtitle there, but learn how to think bigger and lead better and be bolder. Now, tell me all about that.
So the reason that I chose that subtitle was because what I had started noticing, part of the reason for writing this book was in my own journey, in my own experiences, and leaving that, that relatively secure career behind and moving into the total unknown of starting my own businesses. And then as I was growing and scaling those businesses, I found myself being asked to provide formal or informal advice, consulting, sort of mentoring to others who were doing the same. And I found that again and again and again, both through my own experience of what I was building and scaling and working with others, those were the three big themes that kept coming up, was like thinking bigger, leading better, right? The actual practice of being a leader and someone who's creating something, but also leadership from wherever you are in an organization, and how we create that sort of leadership mindset. And then of course being bolder, and both in an external way with what our ambitions are and how we set those, but also internally about how we perceive our own capabilities and how we sometimes maybe misperceive what those capabilities are and some of the baggage we carry around that. And so the conversations just always fell into, almost inevitably, I mean, not every single one, but the vast majority of them fell into these three buckets. And again, in my own work, when I was creating my own businesses from scratch, I found these were the things that I was struggling with the most. And so the book is full of tools drawn from my time at the CIA and also from my time in building and scaling my own companies to provide very tangible, real life experience and insights on how anyone, whether you are an official or unofficial leader, or even just want new insights and fresh ideas for your own personal ambitions, anyone can use the tools in the book. They're very, they're very adaptable, they're very tangible, but that was the intention behind it. And of course, like I said, a lot of that, I would say at least a good 50% of it is drawn from my experiences at the CIA, and then, everything else.
So what is the CIA mindset then?
There are two big ones, I would say. One is the official motto, which is our, well, actually, it's the unofficial motto, this speaking truth to power, right? The idea is that we don't create policy, we inform policymakers, and we use intelligence and intelligence analysis to provide the best information we can to those who are then deciding what to do with that information. But the idea of speaking truth to power is that sometimes you have to provide hard truths to those who are in positions of power. You have to give them the news that they might not want to hear or didn't expect to hear, or just, again, what we think is the most balanced picture of what's happening, giving all of the information that we have at our disposal. And that idea of, well, two things from just within that is, one, not being afraid to have those difficult conversations, right? And not kowtowing to hierarchy or rank and in any way changing the message just because you don't want to upset the people at the top, right? Again, speaking truth to power. And then embedded within that is also this real humility around what all of the things that we don't know, all of the things that we can't predict, we cannot foresee, and yet not shying away from admitting, hey, Mr. President, here's what we know. Here's our best analysis given this body of information. But also, here's all of the stuff we don't know, or some of the things that are gray areas, or some of the, the big holes, perhaps, or the big uncertainties that could affect our analysis, but we just don't have enough intelligence yet, or maybe ever, to be able to give you some definitive insights. And that combination of, again, providing those tough conversations and those tough messages when needed, regardless of who you're sharing them with, of course, in a relevant way. And also acknowledging what the bounds of your expertise and your knowledge are, that humility of knowing this is what I do know and where I can add value and this is where I can't. And also being very clear and sharing that and saying, I don't know when you don't know, was that sort of a huge part of that mindset. And also the other part, and this is the sort of the embodied in the thinking bigger and being bolder part, is the sense of like, given the realities of the world, right? We're not going to scream into the wind and cry about how unfair things are or how unmeritocratic or whatever. This is the world we are all operating in, eyes wide open. And yet we will try our hardest to do what it is that we set out to do, to be ambitious, to decide when we give up or when we, keep going. And that sense of sort of indomitability, the way I refer to it in the book is enlightened swagger, right? This enlightenment that comes from accepting and acknowledging the world and its complexities and all of the things outside of our control. And yet, in the face of that, having this confidence to go out and try to do things that might scare you, that might seem impossible, but at least be willing to give it a go. And I think that balance is a huge part of that mindset.
Thank you. I love that, because I came up with a collective noun for socialized mavericks, which was a swagger of mavericks.
Yeah.
So when you've got enlightened swagger, I had to smile because I thought, I like that. I like that. Fits in perfectly.
Cool.
So in your book, you talk about, under the thinking bigger part, you talk about going deep into your identity. What do you mean exactly?
Yeah, I think for so many of us, and again, this is born from my own experience, but also the, hundreds and thousands of people I've worked with at this point, is so many of us can fall into a routine, right? Where a path is set out before us, or people tell us, oh, well, people like us do this, but we don't do that. Or we have our own noise around what is possible and who we are, what someone like us has to do or is supposed to do. And so much of that is not internally generated. So much of that comes from our families, our societies, our cultures, our teachers, other, sort of forms of authority and leadership. And so fundamentally, in order to think bigger, you have to be thinking your own thoughts, right? And not just passively be taking on other people's. And so the first almost third of the book is really about a keen self-awareness and self-analysis. So you can start to unpack what are my values? What are my ambitions? What are my dreams, my goals, my whatever? And what is everybody else's or what has been given to me and I have just accepted without question? But also, what are my strengths? So many people, and we're socialized and institutionally through schools and work, we're socialized to always be focusing on our developmental areas and developing our weaknesses instead of really crystallizing and leveraging our strengths. And so, again, all of this initial groundwork around self-analysis and self-awareness helps you first and foremost decide what it is that you care about and you want to pursue. And then what are you uniquely armed and qualified to leverage in support of those goals and those ambitions. So it's really about separating all the noise that we get from the world and, our life experience to date and really focusing and then making very tangible what it is that we care about, how we operate, what our high performance contexts are, what are some of the things that drive us instinctively, all of that really, really sort of theoretical stuff. I give a lot of exercises to make it tangible, to make it less of a guessing game and to make it very clear. These are my values. These are my strengths. This is what the impact I want to have in my community or in my family or in the world, instead of leaving it to chance or to be something that is defined for us by other people.
Okay, thank you for that. So I guess you can't own who you are unless you know who you are.
Exactly. exactly that. Yeah. Usually, so again, this is, it's not a criticism, it's just a description, but so many people own who somebody else wants them to be. And I think that's where some of especially by certain stages in life, can be where so much of the tension and the disconnect, the stress, the burnout, all of these physiological things can often, not always, but often come, they have roots in, gosh, well, have I been pursuing the wrong thing my whole life, right? Or whose dream am I living? Or whose values have I taken on? But even though they, don't fully align with my own, it's all of that it's exactly as you said. You can't own who you are until you understand who you are versus who other people have told you are.
Yeah, I find it quite surprising how readily people accept being told who they are by people who don't know them.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And also we have this evolutionary sort of instinct that did serve a purpose in the past of over remembering and over relying on the negative information, right? All of the things that keep us small, all of the criticisms that we've received, those are far more present in our minds than the good stuff. But again, historically, many, many, many thousands of years, tens of thousands of years ago, only focusing on the negative data kept you alive, right? That is scary. That animal, sort of tried to bite me in the past, or that berry made me really sick. All of the negative information we remember much more readily because it kept us alive. Now it just keeps us really small, and it keeps, in many ways, our spirits sort of from being fully alive and our dreams from being fully alive. And I know this sounds a little bit sort of woo and out there, but the reality is exactly that we don't think of the things that we are excellent at. We don't often remember all of the constructive feedback and the positive feedback we've got, and we instead have a bias towards the negative. And that doesn't often, if ever, really serve us well. It can protect us in some very narrow way, but it does also then keep us playing far smaller than I think many of us, one, would like to play and also can. And that's why this is about really flipping so many of the scripts that we have internalized without really interrogating or without having given ourselves the time to question why we've just internalized.
Let's listen to a quick advert.
The Maverick Paradox. Judith Germain is an author, speaker, consultant, mentor, and trainer, and the leading authority on Maverick leadership. She is the founder of the Maverick Paradox, which supports organizations to enhance their leadership capabilities and to help business owners develop and grow their businesses. Judith enables individuals, business owners, and organizations to improve their impact and influence. She is also HR Zone's leadership columnist, and her expert opinion has appeared in national, international, and trade press.
Welcome back to the Maverick Paradox. This is the podcast for the pathologically curious.
So would it be fair to say that your book's a lot about leading yourself as an individual and what you do with yourself?
Yep.
As opposed to the extension of that, how you interact with others. Your book's a real kind of self-leadership book, isn't it?
It's at its core, it is that, but it's because you can't lead others until you figure out how to lead yourself. You can't do anything in the world or in your community until you've gotten your own stuff figured out. And so for me, it's fundamentally about leading your own life, right? Leading a life that feels resonant to you, feels right for you, feels honest, all of those things. And leading in the sense of how, your day-to-day activities, your actions, lead a life of a certain kind, but also how, again, you lead yourself and everybody around you, whether or not you have an official title. This is not just for those who have an official title, of course. For me, the leadership, the way I think about it and the way I talk about it in the book is strategic. It's holistic, right? It's how you lead your life, how you lead yourself, how you, sort of lead even without being given a title or a corner office. It's all of the big and small things. And as you said, much of that is leading self first and foremost. So then you can be better at doing all of those other things.
Brilliant, thank you. I think one of the things about leadership that can be quite annoying, I guess, is when people are ignorant or willfully ignorant. So I'm kind of curious that one of the things we're trying to avoid is this willful ignorance. And you talk about being tactfully ignorant. So tell me about that.
Yeah. So tactical ignorance is the opposite of ignorance, right? Yes, actual ignorance and burying your head in the sand is not a good thing, especially as a leader, but also just as a human being, right? You don't just pretend the problems don't exist and they'll go away. That's not how it works. So it's not about ignorance. It's about really the tactical part, which is what makes it a really powerful tool. It's about being very careful and intentional about the things that you are letting into, in particular, into your headspace, right? So a concrete example of this, and I talk about it a bit in the book, when I was 26 years old, I volunteered to go into an active war zone. And my role was to be the civilian intelligence briefer to the 4-star general who was in charge of US and international forces. And I could have gone into that context being like, oh my gosh, I'm a civilian. I'm so young. I'm on his territory. I'm a woman. I'm a, young woman of color, all of these things. And he's so important. He's a 4-star general. And all of that noise around, oh my gosh, he's this big, important person. And here I am, lowly old me, that could have spun me up into all of the, a lot of us do this when we're giving a presentation or having a conversation. We put other people on pedestals and minimize ourselves. And in that instance, I very consciously told myself, very tactically told myself, I was going to ignore all of that stuff around rank and hierarchy. I was actively not going to study, what the various symbols meant on various people's lapels or, epaulets and that kind of thing. Obviously, 4 stars, there's no way of ignoring that, but just not letting any of that noise in because I knew it would affect the way I did my job. And my job was to deliver the most impactful, insightful briefing to him that I could every single time I saw him. And so by tactically ignoring all of that other stuff around hierarchy and atmospherics, I was able to then focus on my value in that context, which was to be the best prepared I could possibly be, to try to anticipate his questions, to understand how he receives information so I can make it, in the most relevant way possible. All of the things within my control, focusing on those things instead of all of the other stuff. And so that's where it can be a really, really powerful tool. It's, both a mindset tool, but also it can be a very tangible tool in the sense of like, well, what are the inputs you are letting in? What impact are they having on you? And what do you need to curate out or tactically ignore in order to help you achieve that goal, right? Another example from the book is when you start a business or if you start anything new, it is so terrifying. It is so scary. There are infinite ways that it can all go totally wrong. But just because the odds are stacked against you doesn't mean you have to, go into endless detail about how high and complex and big and naughty the stack. you acknowledge that, fine, but you don't need to go down that rabbit hole of and obsess over it. Instead, you tactically ignore that. You let in what's relevant so that you're not, total like ignoramus about it, but then you proceed and you let in other information. Well, how could this be done? Who are the people I know who have done this successfully? What advice do I need to get? What do I need to learn? All of that stuff that will help you achieve that thing that you want to achieve, instead of being distracted by all of the things that will make it harder or make it impossible, or, we're going to pull you in a different direction.
Okay, that makes sense. Because I was sitting there trying to get behind the idea of ignorance and then being attacked,
Yeah.
But then I've got.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to say, I'll give a really personal example that might sort of help crystallize it for some of your audience. So I'm also a parent, in addition to the other many hats that I wear, as many of your audience will. And for both of my pregnancies so far, I have been what has been medically defined as a geriatric mom. So I had my first daughter at 36, my second daughter at 40. And in both times, I could have, because there is endless stuff out there in the world and, in the internet universe, I could have been like, oh, well, what are the risks and how hard is it going to be? And what are all of the challenges of being a geriatric mom? But again, I knew that wasn't going to serve me. One, because there was nothing I could do about it, right? I couldn't change the fact that I was 36 and 40 when I had my kids. Things happened that made it, that's what it was. Secondly, it wasn't going to help me. Knowing all of those risks were not relevant to me, because what was relevant to me, well, what are my specific risks, right? As a person who has my health profile and who has my level of activity and nutrition and lifestyle and all of those other things that are within my control. So I ignored all of that stuff. I went on what I refer to as a low info diet. And what I let in was the advice and insight from qualified people. So those who have some form of, formal qualification in providing insight and advice, doctors, midwives, all of that kind of stuff. Also other women who have done it at advanced maternal age, as they called us. and again, being tactical about all of the other stuff that I kept out, because again, it wasn't going to help, right? Knowing how difficult, knowing how many miscarriages, knowing the percentages of X, Y, and Z, there was nothing I could do about it. And the reality was that for me, I have a different body, I have a different life, I have a different, all of these things. So who I was letting in were those who knew me, who had done it in some way, who were qualified to give me insight and advice, and ignore all of the other stuff. That's where the tactical part comes in. It's not being ignorant, right? Of course I knew there were risks. There are risks with everything that we do as human beings. But I didn't need to solely focus on all of the risks and the things that could go wrong, because they weren't always relevant. So fundamentally, it's about parsing what is relevant information and what is not relevant information. Let in the relevant stuff, all of the irrelevant stuff that is also stuff that you cannot control, you tactically ignore it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because I was thinking about what you were saying there, and it made me think about how I look at some stuff as well. And it's interesting when you're working with people and something's happened and people can get really hung up on stuff that's irrelevant. Now, I know they're emotionally driven,
Yes. Yeah.
but it's not helpful in the present time. No, it's a bit like, I don't know. So I'm talking about when I was not in senior leadership, I wasn't in management, where, someone gets made redundant, or, a whole load of people are getting made redundant, and people are talking about how unfair it is and this, and it's like, that makes sense, when you're first, when you're processing it. But when you're now getting down the line to have the conversations, still talking about how unfair it is isn't going to change the fact that you now need to negotiate what your end package is going to be. Because if it's been the whole time talking about it's unfair, you're not really focusing what's important at right now, at that moment.
Yeah.
And I suppose that is what you're saying, is about tactical ignorance, and saying, is this where I am right now, this additional stuff, is that serving me? Or can I just put that in a box?
Exactly.
I'll deal with, when I get home, when I'm with my partner, the emotions part, and we'll have a good cry about it and we'll shout and be angry. But when we're sitting in that meeting, we're going to be seriously focused on what's serving you right now.
Exactly. And believe me, I fall into that trap even now, right? Like, of this idea of like, oh, well, it's the principle of the thing. They shouldn't have done this, or they should. And fairness, for me, like justice and fairness is a huge core makeup of my value system. And so anytime there's any threat to any of those things, it gets me really riled up. And anytime I do this as a habit now, because I so many things will sort of raise those alarm bells. Anytime I find myself saying it's the principle of the thing, I know my emotions are getting over involved. And so what I do when that word principle pops up into my mind, I immediately say, okay, yes, there are principles at play here, but what is my end goal here? Given the realities, exactly like you said, given the realities that, I've been made redundant, or this person, did something wrong to me, or this is unfair. Fine. That's what it is. Yes, there are principles. Park those to one side for a minute or for a while. What do I want out of this context? What is possible in this context? And it just gives you that sense also of control, to some extent, control back. And you're not, it takes that feeling of victimhood and feeling overwhelmed by how unfair the world is. And it just gives you something else to focus on, which is, well, what can I do about it? Right? None of us are totally, lacking in any agency or any ability to affect anything. So what can I do whenever I, in any context? I won't be able to control everything. I won't be able to sort of push as many buttons and levers as I would like. But what can I do given these realities is a much better way of dealing with those times, for me anyway, when I feel offended, frustrated, angry, unfairly done by, all of those things. That is just the world we live in. And so instead of, again, screaming into the wind, right? And like, oh, this is so unfair. Yes, you're right. Probably many unfair things will happen, but what can you do about it and move forward? That for me is like, well, what can I do? It always comes back to, what can I control? There are many things I cannot control, but what can I control? And in that context, it's the exact same thing. Going into this whole sort of deep conversation and a dissertation about how unfair, the redundancy is, it is what it is. So what can I do now to negotiate the best package for myself to make it, at least as to take some of the sting away? And that should be where the focus goes.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think to do it is to be human. I think it's more about the when and the where. So similar to you, when you say the principle of thing, when I hear myself going, you know what, I'm not like emotional about it. I'm not that upset. Like it's not bothering me in my heart, but intellectually speaking, when I hear that, I'm like, that's when I need to detach, because I'm not actually bothered. It's it's, as you say, it's the justice of the thing.
Yeah.
Fair, and how dare people be like this? Or
exactly.
So when I hear myself go, intellectually speaking, I'm annoyed. I'm like, what? Stop. Now you need to pull back. But I think it's not to say if you get upset about the things in life that happen, because we all do.
Of course.
It's just, as I say, it's one of timing. Sometimes, so I will admit this now, but back in the day, it wouldn't be unusual for me to be in the toilet. Right.
Yes.
Out,
even now, I'm not going
to the tears and coming out and go, right, okay, so this is what we're going to do now. Blah blah blah. So there's no shame in emotion at all.
And Judith, I will tell you. So, and again, I talk about this a little bit in the book. One of my key tools, even now, and one of the things that so many people that I've sort of shared this tip with have found so much value from, is exactly what you just said, is locking yourself in the bathroom, because some of us need to vent our emotions, right? Some of us are emotive people, and I have very high highs and very low lows, even now. And so what I have found, though, is instead of going into that sort of vortex of negativity and anger and frustration and all of those things that I used to do that would sometimes last anywhere from a few days to sometimes a few months, right? Where you're like, and then that thing happened, and then that person did that thing, and you're replaying it. What I do now, and what is so powerfully productive, is I set an alarm. I set an alarm for 15 minutes in which I will scream, I will snot, I will cry, I'll go into the bathroom or under the covers or punch a pillow or whatever it is, right? I will do it. And then when that 15-minute alarm goes off, that's the signal to me and my brain to like wipe my face up, blow my nose, whatever it is, and then focus on that first step. It doesn't have to solve all the things, but what is that first, even tiny step that I can take to help me move into a more productive cycle? Calling a colleague or a trusted friend, or I don't know, asking for advice, or reflecting on something positive. It can be something really, really small or big, but it's about not letting that spiral of negativity then just consume your whole life, because it will narrow your thinking. It will do many bad things, but also if we're thinking about solutions and ways forward, it will keep you so narrowly focused on all the things that you're angry about or that you hate, and will keep some really amazing potential solutions and ways forward outside of like what you're letting in. So again, get the emotions out. Some of us need to. I still need to. But don't let them consume you. Don't let your emotions be the ones who are calling all the shots, especially when there's so many things that can potentially sort of make you feel angry or sad or frustrated or, this is unjust or whatever. You also have to learn how to pick your battles, right? Not everything can consume you or it should be something that you're investing all of your energy and efforts and time and intellect into solving. Yes, there are many things wrong with the world in big and small ways, right? In our personal lives, professional lives, globally, whatever, but we can't fight all battles. So it's also about, yeah, fine, get the emotions out, do something productive, but also focus where you are putting those attention and pick your battles very carefully based on what is most important to you and not just every little thing, like you said, that you read in the news or that, you overhear or someone does. It's not worth your time. And you also don't have the luxury of endless time, endless energy, endless resources to throw at everything. So focus all of that on the things that you truly care about.
Mm. Yeah, what made me think when you was talking is that there's a probably not spoken of downside of being able to compartmentalize feelings from action, or appearing to be able to do that without pain. Because I mean, there are many people all around the world sitting there crying in toilets at work, which is one of the reasons why I've got into leadership in the first place. So there's less people doing that. But I think that people do that and then come out of the toilets being professional. But what can happen is that people then feel that you are unfeeling or you don't care because you're trying to be professional, so nobody don't see you crying in the toilet. But then people feel like you're cold and lack empathy because you're not crying. But there's no winning, is it? Because if you cry in the workplace, especially if you're a woman, men will probably get actually more of a kick if they were crying in the workplace.
Sure.
But if you don't, it's like, how can she deal with that? They're so unfeeling. I remember years ago, my first redundancy I had to do with a colleague. And I think it was the first time for both of us. And we were both relatively young. And tore us apart. We got through it, closed the blinds, and we just cried. We just cried and cried and cried because it was just so traumatic. And then we sorted ourselves out. And I remember people saying, "Look at those two, they don't even care." And we literally spent 10 minutes crying, but nobody saw that. And they were like, "Look, they're so unfeeling." And we were sitting there thinking, "Oh my gosh, we've got another 10 of these today." So I think I learned that not necessarily with redundancies per se, but there are times where you need to show some vulnerability.
Sure. Because
people will treat you in a way that is more hurtful to you in the long run.
Yeah. And I think, but some of it is also, I guess, a couple of things that sort of came to mind when you were sharing that story is, to some extent, we also shouldn't feel pressured to perform our emotions, right? Because you care, right? Just because you're not sobbing in the moment, clearly you care, and you can show, not you specifically, but we can show we care, not necessarily by, sort of crying our eyes out in front of others, but what are the steps we do to make that redundancy, for example, as easy on that person or as thoughtful on, the realities that they're contending with. So you might not cry, but you care and through your actions and your behaviors. And actually, in some ways, actually in most ways, your actions or one's actions are far more indicative of our values and our feelings than anything that we can say, because sometimes it can be performative. And I think, the other element is also for those, for example, I'll stay with the example you shared, for those 10 conversations that you had to have, every single one of those people isn't coming in either as an objective person who's going to be able to say whether or not you were feeling or unfeeling, because of course they've just been given this hugely life-changing news. And so their perceptions of how much or how little you care are, of course, also going to be biased by how they are coming into the situation and the information they are receiving. And so all we can do is behave in good faith in ways that are honest, that feel true. It doesn't have to be overly dramatic. It can be whatever, as big or as little as we like. But the reality is we can also never control how it's perceived, because there's no way for us to know how the people, across from us are going to receive the information or to respond to the information, regardless of how we are sort of showing or not showing our emotions. So some of it is also, sort of let it be what it is, right? Being a leader is hard. Being a human being is hard without us constantly having to think through every single permutation and every single element of every behavior and of every conversation. Do the best that you can. And at the end of the day, for me, it's like, yeah, I won't always get it right. It won't always be received the way I had hoped, but I'm trying my best, and I can sleep at night knowing that I have tried my best. And that really is all that we can do, whether or not tears, sort of are part of that process.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think the reason it was so harrowing for us isn't because it was the first time, but it was because we were so caring. We allowed the other person to read their own emotions and go through it, because that was our duty of care for that individual. It wasn't about how we felt about it. It was letting that person express what they needed to express. And to be honest, being ex-HR, I've seen people do disciplinaries, and sometimes like the manager starts crying and go, I'm so sorry. And that's the worst thing you can do. I mean, how dare you do that to the person that's facing the situation? They don't want to carry your burden as well. But I think it's like you say, leadership is hard, and right is hard.
Yeah,
because there's times where you have to feel the pain so other people don't, and that's part. And you can't moan about it. That's just the way it is. That's you're there to take care of people, whether you're hiring them or firing them. It's the same duty of care that you have all the way through.
Yes, exactly.
Even if it means that your heart's ripped out because they're being mean. You know what, Rupal, this has been a really cool conversation, and thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Before we wrap it up, is there anything that you want to end the conversation with?
Yeah, I think sort of what the last, I would say, like bit of sharing that I want to do is something that goes back to this idea of people, right? We just talked about having conversations and the people and all of that stuff, and how much others can give us and how much we take and all of that. And I think for me, if I had to crystallize my entire life of like insights or observations or anything like that, it goes back to something we talked about in the beginning, which is context, right? Context is so, so important. And so whatever you are doing at work, at home, at whatever element of your life, it's so important to be careful with the people you are letting in to your world, because they will either pull you forward and inspire you and push you and be with you, or they will keep you static or even, pull you backwards. And, there's a lot of research that proves that we are the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. So at every stage, and I do this is not just I'm sharing this, but whenever I'm doing something new or I feel it's just a shift in myself and my life, I do an inventory effectively of who are the 5 people that I'm spending the most time with, and what impact are they having on my life? Are they adding? Are they helping? Are they, sort of providing something that is going to fuel me and keep me forward? Not that we use people as instruments. That's not what I'm saying. But given that we do take on so much from those around us, just be very careful of who those people are, because you get this one life, you get this one chance to do what it is that's important to you. So don't just let anybody in just because they're related to you, or just because you have a history, or just because you've been friends for decades. You can maintain relationships without them being the people who are the closest to you and you're spending the most time with. So that would be the one sort of thing that I would love to leave your audience with, is just be very conscious of those 5.
Brilliant. I like that. And I would add, be conscious of when you're somebody else's 5, what are you bringing into that?
Exactly. Yes.
Because it might be you need to take yourself away because you are actually toxic to them.
Yeah.
Even though you might not mean to, you might not be that right person for them right then.
Exactly.
This is, as I say, been a fantastic conversation. So thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. And thank you once again for tuning in to the Maverick Paradox podcast. I'm Judith Germain, your host, and I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation.
The Maverick Paradox Magazine. The Maverick Paradox Magazine is for the pathologically curious. Written by a swagger of socialized mavericks who are divergent thinkers, the magazine tackles the biggest issues affecting maverick leaders today. You might be a business owner or a leader within an organization who wants to have your thinking challenged, to be exposed to a diversity of thought, or to learn from diverse experts in their fields. If so, the Maverick Paradox Magazine is for you. Join the swagger at themaverickparadox.com and engage in the conversation.